Chapter 2, Enlightened Opinion. The court of Versailles, where Louis XVI passed his days according to a timetable first elaborated a century earlier, was Louis XIV's most spectacular legacy. Nor was its influence confined to France. By the early 18th century, admiring fellow monarchs were building imitations of the sprawling palace and its lavish ornamental gardens all over Europe. From Sarkoje Silo outside St. Petersburg in the east to Aranjuez near Madrid in the west. From Drottningholm, refuge of Swedish monarchs, in the north to Caserta in the Neapolitan south. Rulers built themselves out-of-town seats to display their power and flaunt their pleasures. Nor were such piles the only homage paid by foreigners to French cultural prestige in the afterglow of the Sun King. French architecture, French furniture, French fashions dominated continental taste down to the middle of the 18th century. And even when, after that, things English came into vogue, they made their appearance in a French mirror. Above all, educated Europe adopted the French language, with the exception of England and Spain. It was the preferred tongue of courts everywhere. Recalling court life at Schönbrunn under the Empress Maria Theresia, one of her familiars noted that French was then the language of the upper classes and indeed of cultivated society in general. In those days, the greater part of high society in Vienna could say, "I speak French like Diderot and German like my nurse." In Frederick II's Berlin or Catherine II's St. Petersburg, monarchs gorged on Parisian culture created in an atmosphere in which their courtiers almost completely forgot their native languages from lack of use. But even at lower levels, nobody now considered themselves educated without a thorough familiarity with French. By the 1770s, a certain backlash was beginning. Writers like Herder in Germany or Alfieri in Italy were raging against their compatriots' servile deference to an alien culture. But as yet, their followers were few. Meanwhile, people of education found themselves unprecedentedly well equipped to follow events in France, form judgments about what was happening there, and absorb the ever-swelling outpourings of French literary life. While monarchs willingly subscribed to the Correspondance littéraire issued from Paris by the expatriate German Baron Grimm from 1754, their subjects, at less cost, found an expanding range of other journals to keep them well informed. The unadventurous could confine themselves to the long-established Mercure de France for news of public events, or the Journal des Savants for learned ones. But both these periodicals were semi-official and subject to close government censorship. From the mid-century, a wide range of more independent journals, some specialized and some not, became available. Most had an ephemeral existence, and few of those which survived could have done so without the efforts of one or two persistent individuals. Nevertheless, in the 70 years between 1715 and 1785, the number almost quadrupled from 22 to 79. And it was quite beyond the government's resources to supervise the contents of them all. Indeed, the one it was always keenest to censor, the Jansenist Nouvelle Ecclésiastique, which from 1728 onwards kept up a regular critical commentary on the management and outlook of the established church, always eluded attempts to find its presses. Journals identified openly with particular individuals, such as the popular conservative Année littéraire of Féron, appearing from 1754, or the unpredictable Annales politiques civiles et littéraires produced from 1777 by Linguet, were more vulnerable. Linguet spent the years 1780 through 82 in the Bastille for his journalistic excesses. But even then, Surrogates kept his fortnightly commentary going, and the memoirs he wrote on his release, initially appearing in his Annals before separate publication, became a bestseller with their lurid evocation of the living death suffered by all those whom the whim of despotism chose to consign to that lowering and mysterious fortress. Henceforth, however, Linguet took the precaution of publishing outside French jurisdiction in the Austrian Netherlands. In fact, the boldest French language periodicals had always been produced beyond the frontier. Oldest and most respectable was the Gazette de Leyde, founded in Holland by Huguenot refugees in 1677 and still under Protestant direction. It provided its readers with detailed and well-informed accounts of French domestic politics and the issues at stake in them, with a gentle but persistent bias against authority. Almost as popular, though less well known, was the fortnightly Courrier d'Avignon, published from 1733 in that enclave of papal territory in the south. The more conservative but well-informed Courrier du Bas-Rhin was produced in Prussian Cleves, while the intellectually radical Journal Encyclopédique came out in the tiny independent South Belgian Principality of Bouillon. The circulation of such journals was Europe-wide, and demand for them grew enormously in the news-laden 1770s, with major political upheavals to report from Scandinavia, Russia, and Poland, not to mention France itself, and, greatest of all, the American struggle for independence. From a few hundred in the 1750s, the Gazette de l'Aide was producing around 4,200 copies by 1785. Over half of these were sold outside France. But inevitably, by far the biggest single market for French language journalism was within the kingdom itself. There, local papers also made their appearance. Paris had a weekly news and advertising sheet from early in the century. Lyon had one from 1748, and by the 1780s, no self-respecting provincial center was without one. The Journal de Paris came out daily from 1777. 10 years later, perhaps 70,000 copies of newspapers were being regularly sold, reaching a readership of around 500,000. These developments were paralleled by book production, insofar as fragmentary evidence allows us to reconstruct it. Expanding steadily down to the 1770s, it leaped dramatically after that, and went on at an accelerated rate down to the Revolution. Though with some spectacular vicissitudes as censorship policies fluctuated. Technically, all books, and journals too, could only be published if passed or awarded the privilege of being printed, as it was technically known, by a board of censors headed by an official known as the Director of the Book Trade, Librairie. To win such a privilege, they had to contain nothing contrary to religion, government, and morals. The very number of censors, rising from 41 in the 1720s to 178 in 1789, reflects the expanding volume of their work. But, in practice, very few books were banned. Most of those which the censors felt unable to invest with the positive approval signified by privilege were nevertheless granted tacit permission to publish. And even more dubious ones could appear on simple tolerance, with the mere assurance that the police would not act against them. Nothing short of a full privilege, however, could indemnify a book from independent persecution by either the Sorbonne or a parliament. And the government normally stood aside when a sovereign court condemned a book to be publicly torn up and burned for the subversiveness of its contents. Everybody except, seemingly, the magistrates realized that there was no better way to give a book free publicity. But, like the journals, an important proportion of the books sold in France came from abroad, from Holland, from Avignon, from Geneva, or from Neuchâtel, another Prussian enclave, whose main export appears to have been books in French. Most of these imports were unauthorized and came in by tortuous routes to avoid the vigilance of customs men. Even authorized imports were sometimes cut to a trickle, as in the early 1770s by punitive increases in import duties. And in 1783, the whole book trade was plunged into chaos when it was decreed that all imports would have to be inspected by the Booksellers Guild in Paris before delivery to any destination within France. The aim was to weed out pornography, sedition, and pirated editions, but the effect was to make transport costs prohibitive for all books, and even in the booming market that had now established itself. Who bought these ever-proliferating journals, newspapers, and books? Over a third of Louis XVI's subjects could read and write, and there was a steady market for cheap popular literature, such as almanacs and traditional tales of wonder, sold by traveling hawkers and known from their covers as the Blue Library. But cost alone restricted the sale of more sophisticated books and journals. A subscription to the Gazette Delayed cost 36 livres a year. The Année Littéraire and the Journal Encyclopédique were 24 livres each, and the Courrier d'Avignon 18. Even the most skilled craftsmen could not earn more than 30 livres a week, and most earned half that or less, making even the purchase of an occasional book all but impossible. The better off themselves might find the cost of keeping up with literature and current affairs daunting, but it was much eased in the course of the century by the appearance of subscription libraries and reading rooms, with membership fees around the cost of a single journal subscription. The first to be recorded appeared in Nantes in 1759. And 30 years later, there were 5 more in the same city, housing more than 3,000 volumes between them. During that time, similar institutions sprang up throughout the provinces, devoted, like that established in Bayeux in 1770, to finding decent diversion in reading literary and political news. Sometimes they had rooms set aside for conversation too. But discussion was the main function of a different type of institution which also blossomed over the 18th century, the literary society. They too had libraries and subscribed to journals, but they also held regular public sessions, sometimes interspersed with concerts, at which their members read their own works or debated questions of the day. Sometimes, too, they organized public lectures and essay competitions, open to all, but usually with a much higher subscription than the average reading room. They often adopted high-sounding names like Société de Philaeth, Société de Philosophie et des Belles Lettres, Logopanthe, Musée, Société Patriotique. By 1787, noted a Dijon newspaper, one sees societies of this sort in almost all the towns of the kingdom. Such an agreeable resource for the select class of citizens in all walks of life. The most select of all such bodies, however, were the academies, where membership was by election only. Numbers were often deliberately limited, and the society enjoyed the official recognition of royal letters patent. They, too, were largely a product of the 18th century. In 1700, apart from the great metropolitan bodies like Académie Française, the Académie des Sciences, and the Académie des Inscriptions et Belles Lettres, only 7 provincial academies existed. By 1789, the number had risen to 35. Most had their own premises and libraries, and had in fact usually evolved from humbler literary societies. But in the end, academic exclusivism was probably one reason why the latter spread so rapidly. Only 6,000 Frenchmen secured membership of an academy over the whole century, and of these a disproportionate 37% or more were nobles. Yet their cultural preeminence was undoubted. Their rare public sessions commanded unrivaled attention. Their lists of foreign associates and correspondents conferred unique prestige, and their essay competitions attracted literary hopefuls from far and wide, and sometimes helped to launch a promising career. The most famous case was Jean-Jacques Rousseau's triumph in the Dijon Academy's competition of 1750. Access to literature, therefore, was not confined to individual buyers of books and journals, but there was no great social difference between those who bought for themselves and those who relied on institutional libraries. The reading classes were overwhelmingly made up of nobles, clerics, and the professional bourgeoisie. Mostly they lived in towns, and uncommercial towns at that. Merchants and manufacturers were far less interested in the world of ideas than magistrates, lawyers, administrators, and army officers. I do not expect you will be able to sell any here, wrote a bookseller in Bar-le-Duc in the Neuchâtel Publishers, promoting a new expanded edition of the famous Encyclopédie in 1780. Having offered them to everybody here, nobody so far has come looking for a copy. They are more avid for trade than for reading, and their education is quite neglected. The merchants prefer to teach their children that 5 and 4 make 9 minus 2 equals 7, than in telling them to refine their minds. To join the expanding cultivated elite, in fact, disposable income needed to be spent not only on reading, but before that on the right sort of education. Louis XVI came to the throne. The French educational system was in turmoil, as was that of much of Catholic Europe. The cause was the dissolution of the Jesuits, who had dominated the higher education of Catholic elites since the late 16th century. Finally disbanded by the Pope in 1773, they had been expelled from France in 1764, and their 113 colleges, out of a total nearing 400, had been sequestrated. Some disappeared, some passed into the hands of other regular orders, some were taken over by secular priests under municipal supervision. In these varying circumstances, the fairly uniform curriculum they had taught dissolved, and although there was much public discussion of what to put in its place, no action on a kingdom-wide scale was taken. In 1789, one boy in 52 out of the 8 to 18 range was attending a college, but the educational experience of them and their predecessors over a generation was much more diverse than that of their fathers and grandfathers. Many more were now boarders, too, cut off for long periods from their families. Even so, solid grounding in the Latin classics was still regarded as the essential foundation of a superior education. 4 hours a day of ancient Rome, its language and its culture, occupied 6 years of most college courses. Much of the time remaining was devoted to the inculcation of Catholic orthodoxy. Although after 1760, there was time in some courses for a little geography and some French history. Those who went beyond this basic cycle of the humanities, however, and most of those hoping for professional careers went on to take a further 2 years conventionally called philosophy, where they were introduced to the natural sciences. Here too, tradition ostensibly ruled, and the authority of Aristotle went formally unchallenged. But behind this facade, the lessons of the scientific revolution of the previous century and the methods and approaches that had brought them about had been widely propagated in the colleges from the 1690s onwards. All right. Okay. Neither ancient Rome nor the Christian religion had played much part in the triumph of a rational, experimental approach to natural phenomena. Okay. I went to the market today and I wore a mask, but somehow a frog made it into my throat. Okay. And it was impossible to disguise the fact. Nevertheless, okay, brain freeze there. Oh, wow, okay. The new principles continued to be taught. And by the 1760s, Newtonian physics, in one form or another, were standard fare in most colleges. Nature was to be evaluated in terms of what could be shown to work and achieve useful results. It could scarcely be expected that some, at least of those who learned this lesson, should not have thought about judging human affairs by the same standards, for all the precepts of obedience and orthodoxy instilled into them in earlier school years. That, indeed, was the object of the Enlightenment, whose writers set the intellectual agenda for this generation of unprecedented literacy. It was a movement of criticism, whose advocates believed that nothing was beyond rational improvement, and that nothing was justifiable that could not be shown to be useful to humanity or to promote human happiness. They called themselves philosophers, by which they meant independent thinkers committed to the practical improvement of the lot of their fellow men. Most of them thought the way to achieve it lay in appealing to educated general public in works of polemic, simplification, and popularization. The very opposite, as their opponents did not fail to point out, of the traditional detached notion of a philosopher. The supreme example, it has always been agreed, was Voltaire. Born in the last years of the 17th century and Jesuit educated, by the time he was 30, he had already won a reputation for witty anti-clerical writings, and he was to remain a prolific poet and playwright all of his life. But the direction of that life was changed when, in 1726, he traveled to England. Here he saw the benefits of religious pluralism and toleration, discovered the psychology of Locke, the physics of Newton, and the theoretical empiricism of Bacon. He was overwhelmed, and 8 years later conveyed his discoveries to compatriots largely ignorant of English in his Lettres Philosophiques. Banned and publicly burned by the Parliament, they nevertheless sold sensationally well, making Locke and Newton household names in educated French circles. Voltaire also wrote works of history. Indeed, he became historiographer royal, and in 1746 was elected to the Académie Française. But his brushes with authority were as constant as his jibing against the church. And finally, in 1759, he took up permanent residence at Ferney, close to the safety of the Swiss border. Here, he almost literally held court, receiving eminent pilgrims from all over Europe, conducting a voluminous correspondence, and launching ferocious propaganda campaigns against the infamy of religious intolerance and barbarous miscarriages of justice. Okay. In 1778, after an absence of 28 years, he made a triumphal return to Paris, where he was lionized for 4 months in a way few writers can ever have experienced. The strain killed him. The example of his success, however, was an inspiration to innumerable ambitious scribblers throughout the later decades of the century. And later revolutionaries would look back on this tireless critic and campaigner against intolerance and injustice as one of their most distinguished intellectual ancestors. They were more ambivalent about Montesquieu, a magistrate in the Parliament of Bordeaux, a feudal lord living in a moated castle, and an apologist for noble power. Yet, arguably, his intellectual importance was far greater. 5 years older than Voltaire, he died in 1755, leaving a much less voluminous body of writings. But he, too, first made his name in the freer breathing days of the Regency after Louis XVI's death, with the satirical titillating Lettres Persanes, 1721. Actually, Louis XIV's death. Lettres Persanes, 1721. He too was deeply impressed by a visit to England in 1729, a year after his election to the Académie Française. But after that, he fell largely silent until 1748, when he published in Geneva the sprawling, untidy collection of reflections entitled De l'Esprit des Lois. It proved the most fertile and challenging work of political thought of the century, setting out to analyze rather than prescribe. Montesquieu argued that forms of government are the products of natural and historical circumstances and cannot therefore be varied at will. Such arguments offered comfort to all established authorities, yet he also roundly condemned despotism, the government of one man according to no law but his own his own caprice, and implied that even true monarchs who ruled only according to law were always under the temptation and danger of becoming despotic. Intermediary powers were needed, buffers between them and their subjects, to restrain that tendency. Montesquieu suggested that in France the nobility and the parliaments constituted such buffers, and, not surprisingly, these bodies were eager to invoke his authority in later struggles against the government. Despotism became a convenient battle cry against any exercise of power, arbitrary or not. And despite preaching that no form of government is appropriate in all circumstances, in attempting to provide an explanation for that of England, Montesquieu was led to propound an ideal type most calculated to promote and preserve liberty. Political liberty could only flourish, he argued, under moderate governments. And what kept them moderate was the balance and separation of the three arms of the executive, the legislative, and the judiciary. In order that power be not abused, things should be so disposed that power checks power. In a number of ways, Montesquieu seriously misunderstood how the English Constitution actually worked. But the principles he thought he saw in it were to prove widely inspirational on both sides of the Atlantic, and not least in revolutionary France. By the time Montesquieu died, the Enlightenment as a movement was beginning to come together. Persecution and harassment at the hands of the church, or those under priestly influence, had given a growing band of speculative writers a sense of common purpose. Nowhere was it better expressed than in the great project launched in 1751 by Diderot, perhaps the first writer to live exclusively by his pen, and the mathematician D'Alembert for a multi-authored French version of a successful English compendium of current knowledge, Chambers' Cyclopedia. The encyclopédie was, however, intended from the start to be more than a simple factual work of reference. Its purpose was to advance knowledge as well as summarize it, and to promote a critical attitude to everything. Its articles would, wrote D'Alembert in a foreword to the third volume, 1753, often give occasion for philosophic reflections, for which the public seems today to have more taste than ever. Thus, it is by the philosophic spirit that we shall attempt to distinguish this dictionary. It is in that way, above all, that it will win the approval for which we are most anxious. By then, its publication had already been suspended once by order of the Royal Council, and as successive volumes continued to appear, soon dwarfing the two of its original model, it came under repeated attack as a repository of skepticism, atheism, and sedition. In 1759, after 7 volumes, the whole project nearly foundered when its privilege to publish was withdrawn. It was only saved when Malesherbes, the liberal magistrate who was director of the book trade between 1750 and 1763, granted tacit permission to continue. The remaining volumes, bringing the entire text to 17, were published in 1765. No sooner was the encyclopédie complete, however, than new and expanded editions began to appear, and in handier formats than the original heavy and expensive folios. I apologize for the smoking, but I fear that on a personal thought, I fear that smoking may be the only thing standing between some persons going ahead and simplifying their life and going directly to jail without collecting $200. By 1789, therefore, something like 25,000 copies of one version or another of this great compendium had been sold, perhaps half of them in France, and although it undoubtedly did constitute a work of reference of unprecedented quality, what sold it was its notoriety, its contempt for authority, and its constant irreverent digs at the church and religion in general. Yet, by the time it became a bestseller, such criticisms had become much more open and widespread, making the subterfuge and ambiguities behind which it veiled its early audacities seem timid. Diderot, disgusted with the whole enterprise long before the first edition was completed, turned from religious and philosophical to political and economic radicalism in his later years, although long habit had taught him to cover his tracks. When he died in 1784, he was chiefly known as a sentimental playwright and art critic. Nevertheless, few works were more important than the Encyclopédie, which he had orchestrated and edited in promoting the values of independent thinking and indifference to authority. Encyclopedism became a synonym for a refusal to accept anything uncritically. Yet even encyclopedism had its orthodoxies. Hostile to organized religion and intolerance as manifestations of vestigial barbarism and superstition. It held that philosophers were engaged in a winning battle for progress. The world was changing. Nothing was doing more than philosophy to promote that change. And it was change for the better. The material progress of the arts and sciences, of which the Encyclopédie proclaimed itself a reasoned dictionary, was inexorably improving the lot of mankind. Even if natural disasters, like the Lisbon earthquake of 1755, shook their faith in the benevolence of nature, those who considered themselves enlightened continued to believe in the improvement of human institutions. The one significant exception was Rousseau, an autodidact from Geneva. In the 1740s, Rousseau made a living in Paris copying music, but moving in aspiring literary circles. He knew Diderot and collaborated in the early stages of the Encyclopédie. He made his name, however, by disputing Enlightenment orthodoxies. And by the late 1750s, had fallen out with all the movement's leading figures. In the work which first won him public notice, an entry for the Academy of Dijon's Essay Prize competition of 1750, he argued that progress in the arts and sciences had corrupted rather than improved mankind. Man is naturally good, he later wrote, recalling the moment when his intuition first struck him. It has only become bad because of institutions. This conviction suffused all his writings, emphasized by a direct, emotional style, which electrified the reading public throughout Europe. His novels, Julie, ou La Nouvelle Heloise, 1761, and Émile, ou L'Éducation, 1762, were bestsellers, moving their readers to tears at the prospect of innocence and virtue preserved and uncorrupted in the face of the snares and inequities of established society. These triumphs were, however, the achievement of individuals. Rousseau offered no program for changing society wholesale to restore mankind in general to its primal innocence and goodness. Even his most enduring work, The Social Contract, 1762, was not a prescription for political change, but rather a highly theoretical sketch for how political authority might be established legitimately without men losing their natural liberty. It could only work, Rousseau emphasized, in small city-states. Yet, coming from the pen of one who had denounced existing society as rotten and depraving, vaunting the sovereignty of a general will which was always for the best and never wrong, and full of striking formulas, such as its very first sentence, which proclaimed that men were born free but were everywhere in chains. It could not fail to stir thoughts of practical change, though he was at pains to stress that the general will was not necessarily the will of the majority. The term passed quickly into normal usage as meaning just that. And when the established form of government and society collapsed, barely a decade after Rousseau's death in 1778, he was remembered by those welcoming the new times as a prophet who had seen the future, and even bequeathed it a pattern book for organizing and regenerated nation along juster and more virtuous lines. Both Émile and The Social Contract were condemned when they appeared, and Rousseau fled the country, only returning permanently after 8 years of wandering. But it was not the political content of either work that the Parliament of Paris, decreeing his arrest, found offensive. It was the affront to religion in his remarks on civil religion in The Social Contract, and the moving profession of faith of the Savoyard curate in Émile. The former declared Christianity a perpetual source of civil disorders and denounced priests. The latter proclaimed that the true gospel was belief in a benevolent God of nature rather than any particular body of Christian doctrine. Rousseau's temperament was emotional and religious. But in the eyes of the devout, he appeared no less blasphemous than the mocking, irreverent Voltaire. To stem the rising tide of irreligion increasingly came to appear as the main task confronting the church. Refutations of philosophic impieties poured from the presses, and pious laymen in positions of authority used every available means to suppress dissent. But the church itself was not united, and its divisions opened it yet further ridicule. Bitter quarrels over the bull Unigenitus, promulgated in 1713 against Jansenism, lasted half a century and only died down in the late 1760s. Jansenists rejected many of the doctrines and emphasis imposed on the church after the 16th century Council of Trent. The Puritans of the Catholic Church, they opposed lax theology, excessive papal and episcopal power, and above all, the influence of the Jesuits in church and state. It was Jansenists in the Parliament of Paris who engineered the Jesuits' downfall. Although philosophers appalled by the prospect of a Jansenist-dominated church hurriedly claimed it as a victory for enlightenment. But the course of the previous quarrel, with its persecution of priestly dissidents, refusal of sacraments to dying opponents of Unigenitus, and occasional spectacular displays of hysteria and holy rolling, the so-called convulsionaries of Saint-Médard, brought no credit or dignity to any of those involved. So it was not only the scoffing of infidels which spread the conviction that the religious life of France needed comprehensive reform. Besides, sensibilities were changing even among the Orthodox. Less ostentatious forms of piety were finding greater favor. When they made wills, testators endowed fewer memorial masses and expressed their dying beliefs in less elaborate terms. Alive, they lit fewer votive candles and showed less interest in religious confraternities or the austerities of the monastic life. Horace Walpole, prizing in France the romantic devotional trappings that England had lost at the Reformation, was disappointed at the change of atmosphere he found in the convents of Paris in 1771. It is very singular that I have not half the satisfaction in going into churches and convents that I used to have. The consciousness that the vision is dispelled, the want of fervor so obvious in the religious, the solitude that one knows proceeds from contempt, not from contemplation, make these places appear like abandoned theaters destined to destruction. The monks trot about as if they had not long to stay there, and what used to be holy gloom is now but dirt and darkness. And by then, smaller monasteries were being suppressed or merged wholesale. By then, too, the quarrels over unigenitus had lost their urgency with the defeat of the Jesuits. And, beset by unbelievers, Catholics were even showing themselves more tolerant towards French Protestants. Since the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685, Protestants had enjoyed no legal existence. Their baptisms, marriages, and burials enjoyed no status at law, and their pastors committed a capital offense in conducting services. In the course of the 1760s, however, active persecution of pastors ceased, and the open-air services, traditional among the Protestants of Languedoc, were no longer molested. Parish priests might still fulminate against heresy, but the barbarity of intolerance was the preferred theme of many of their bishops. And while the civil authorities still sent out troops to break up Protestant services, they always sent them deliberately in the wrong direction. The horrors of intolerance seemed vividly demonstrated when, in 1762, the Toulouse Protestant Jean Calas was put to death by the Parliament of Languedoc for allegedly murdering his son to prevent him embracing Catholicism. Voltaire, appalled by recent news of what proved to be the last execution of a pastor in the same area, concluded that this was a case of judicial murder inspired by superstitious bigotry. He launched a furious journalistic campaign to rehabilitate Calas, which in 1765 achieved success before the King's Council. In 1775, after a longer struggle, he secured rehabilitation of the Servin family, also condemned in Languedoc for murdering an apostate daughter, although they had escaped Calas's fate by fleeing to Switzerland. Such cases stirred the conscience of educated laymen And by the 1780s, few could be found, openly at least, to uphold the penal laws against Protestants. In Necker, Louis XVI even had a Protestant minister between 1777 and 1781. The final abrogation of their disabilities, already in practical abeyance, seemed only a matter of time. It was not only the bigotry of the Toulouse judges that outraged Voltaire. It was also the cruelty and injustice of the laws which they applied. Calas was broken on the wheel, a grisly process in which the condemned person's limbs were smashed with iron bars and the mutilated corpse raised up for public display on a cartwheel. Even more atrocious punishments were possible. Damiens, a dim-witted jobbing servant who stabbed Louis XV with a penknife in 1757, was first tortured to obtain the names of accomplices, then pinched with red-hot irons, after which 4 horses tried in vain to pull him apart. Regicide was, of course, a particularly heinous crime, with dreadful echoes in French history. And Damiens' execution was based on carefully researched precedents. Thousands thronged the Place de Grève outside the Paris Hôtel de Ville to watch these once-in-a-lifetime refinements on the everyday spectacle of public execution. Another case Voltaire took up was that of Labarre, who, in 1766, convicted of various petty adolescent acts of blasphemy and sacrilege, was tortured and burned at the stake. A copy of Voltaire's own philosophical dictionary was thrown into the flames after him. Laws which condoned such things, the philosopher argued, were monstrous, irrational, and absurd. And he welcomed the French translation in 1765 of Beccaria's plea for a more measured, humane, and torture-free system of criminal justice, of Crimes and Punishments, 1764. By the early 1770s, the government was announcing plans for a general reform and codification of the laws, and Voltaire led the applause for this promise. Nothing, however, emerged during his lifetime, or for a decade afterwards, apart from the abolition in 1780 of torture to obtain confessions. But in the mid-1780s, there surfaced a whole series of miscarriages of justice, which, exploited by an able younger generation of polemicists who swamped the public with thousands of copies of legal briefs, not subject to censorship, reawakened concern at the law's cruelties, inconsistencies, and failure to safeguard innocence. Their inspiration was Voltaire's campaign over Calas, In order to restore the dead martyr's name, he had successfully mobilized public opinion. The idea of public opinion was not new, but in the mid-18th century, its meaning changed. Previously, opinion had meant something distinct from knowledge or truth, merely something that people happened to believe. Now, increasingly, opinion came to imply informed judgment, and public opinion was often described as a tribunal whose verdict was final and usually correct. Among the singularities which mark out the age we live in from all others, wrote Rousseau in 1776, is the methodical and sustained spirit which has guided public opinion over the last 20 years. Until now, these opinions wandered aimless and unregulated at the whim of men's passions, and the endless interplay of these passions made the public float from one to another without any constant direction. Philosophers sought to provide such direction, and after his success over Calas, Voltaire believed it was possible. Opinion governs the world, he wrote, and in the end, philosophers govern men's opinions. But in fact, they were not the first in the field. Both sides in the religious quarrels of mid-century had sought to whip up public support. The Jansenists, with their elusive, secretly published Nouvelle Ecclésiastique, the Jesuits with their Journal de Travaux, not to mention furious pamphleteering by each. And even further back, the parliaments during the Regency had begun to print and publicly distribute their remonstrances. A deliberate tactic to involve educated readers in their political disagreements with the government. These techniques became standard in the 1750s as religious and financial disputes between the crown and the sovereign courts reached a new intensity. The years between 1758 in 1764 saw a last attempt by the traditional organs of censorship to prevent open discussion of matters of state, whether religious, administrative, or financial. Attempts to suppress the Encyclopédie, the works of Rousseau, and other speculative writings were part of this pattern. So was a royal declaration of 1764 prohibiting public sale of any works relating to the finances or administration of the state. But the line could not be held. And indeed, government ministers themselves came increasingly to feel that it was perhaps better for the public to be well informed than uninformed. They even turned to courting opinion for themselves. Preambles to royal edicts grew longer and longer. Unwelcome remonstrances from the parliaments were not only quashed, they were refuted. When Maupeou remodeled the parliaments, he hired a team of writers to praise and defend what he was doing. But mused and anxious and well-placed observer, each step makes matters worse. Somebody writes, another replies. Everybody will want to analyze the constitution of the state. Tempers will be lost. Issues are being raised which nobody would have dared think of. The knowledge the peoples are requiring must, a little sooner or a little later, bring about revolutions. Nothing did more to fuel this surge of public discussion than the 7 Years' War. Undertaken with no clear aims, in alliance with Austria, a traditional enemy of centuries standing, it led to humiliating defeats on land and sea at what seemed like enormous economic cost. Taxes and state borrowing had soared, but there was nothing to show for such efforts. In these circumstances, an inquest began, which spared no aspect of French society or institutions, and was encouraged at a certain level by the government itself. In 1763, unprecedentedly, it even asked the parliaments to make proposals for economic and fiscal reform, which produced nothing very constructive, unwisely flattered their pretensions, and left them aggrieved when, ignoring their suggestions, ministers turned in preference to the untried theories of a group calling themselves by the new and unfamiliar name of economists.